thought he knew. His 8-year-old son Daniel was solving complex mathematical equations on the whiteboard while Maria Santos, the tutor he'd reluctantly hired 3 months ago, guided him through advanced calculus concepts. Daniel had been diagnosed with severe learning disabilities at age 5. The prestigious private school had suggested he might never progress beyond basic arithmetic. Yet here he was, working through problems that challenged high school students. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a blade. Daniel immediately stepped back from the board, his confident demeanor crumbling as his father's shadow filled the doorway. Maria quickly moved between them, her protective instincts kicking in. "Dr. Whitfield, I can explain what we've been working on," Maria said calmly, though she recognized the dangerous tone in the renowned surgeon's voice. "Explain?" Marcus stormed forward, his white coat still bearing traces of the hospital's sterile environment. "Explain how you've somehow convinced my son to perform circus tricks when every educational specialist in Boston has confirmed his cognitive limitations." Maria Santos was 31 years old and held advanced degrees in mathematics and special education from MIT. But to Marcus Whitfield, she was simply the discount tutor he'd hired when the expensive learning centers had given up on Daniel after months of failed progress. "Sir, Daniel has never had learning disabilities," Maria replied steadily, keeping her hand on the boy's shoulder. "He processes information differently, but his mathematical reasoning is extraordinary." Marcus laughed harshly. "Different processing. That's a creative way to describe what the neurologists call severe cognitive dysfunction." His contempt was unmistakable. "My son can barely read at a first-grade level, yet you expect me to believe he understands calculus?" "I don't expect you to believe anything, Dr. Whitfield. I'm asking you to observe," Maria responded. "Daniel, would you like to show your father the architectural project you've been designing?" But Daniel had already retreated to the corner of the room, his earlier confidence completely shattered by his father's presence. The transformation was heartbreaking to witness. "Dad doesn't want to see my work," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible. "He only wants to know what's wrong with me." The simple honesty of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment, his certainty wavered as he looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a failed project, but a child who had learned to hide his light under a bushel of manufactured shame. But Dr. Marcus Whitfield was not a man who admitted error easily. His reputation was built on being right, on fixing what was broken. To acknowledge that Daniel wasn't broken would mean confronting 3 years of his own failures as a father. "Pack your things, Miss Santos," he said coldly. "Your services are no longer required. I'll be contacting the agency about your inappropriate methods." "No," Daniel cried, running to Maria and clutching her arm. "She can't leave. She's the only one who thinks I'm smart." Marcus ignored his son's distress completely. "Daniel, go to your room. The new tutor will arrive next week, and will return to appropriate educational methods." "I don't want a new tutor," Daniel protested, tears streaming down his face. "Maria believes in me. She doesn't make me feel stupid." What happened next would haunt Marcus for months to come. He physically separated Daniel from Maria, ignoring the child's sobs, and instructed the housekeeper to escort his son upstairs and ensure he stayed there until this situation was resolved. As Daniel's bedroom door closed with finality, Maria remained in the study, calmly gathering her materials. She had grown up in East Boston, the daughter of immigrant factory workers who had scraped together every penny to fund her education. She understood what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, and treated as expendable by those who confused privilege with intelligence. "Dr. Whitfield," she said quietly, "may I ask you something before I leave?" Marcus checked his expensive watch with theatrical impatience. "Make it quick. Do you genuinely believe your son lacks ability, or are you afraid of discovering that his mind works in ways that challenge your understanding of intelligence?" The question struck Marcus like a scalpel to the heart. He stepped closer to Maria, his hands clenched in fury. "How dare you question my judgment as a father? I've consulted with the finest specialists, invested thousands in therapies and assessments. I've done everything possible for my son." "Everything except trust him," Maria replied softly. "Daniel doesn't need more specialists, Dr. Whitfield. He needs a father who sees his potential instead of his deficits." Marcus scoffed. Parenting advice from someone barely out of graduate school who has never raised a child. How presumptuous. Maria reached into her briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer. "Dr. Whitfield, over these past 3 months, Daniel has created something remarkable. A complete architectural design for a sustainable housing complex, including structural calculations, environmental impact assessments, and cost projections. He did this work independently, using mathematical concepts he taught himself." As Maria displayed Daniel's work, Marcus felt his world tilt. The designs were sophisticated, creative, and mathematically sound. The environmental calculations showed an understanding of complex systems that impressed even his scientific mind. This is impossible, Marcus whispered, his face draining of color. The learning assessments, the standardized tests, years of educational interventions, your son isn't learning disabled, Dr. Whitfield, Maria continued. He's profoundly gifted, but his abilities don't fit conventional educational models. He thinks in 3 dimensions, sees patterns others miss, and solves problems through intuitive leaps that traditional testing can't measure. The devastating truth began to crystallize in Marcus's mind. He had spent 3 years trying to fix a child who was never broken, forcing a brilliant mind into narrow boxes that could never contain its true capacity, but admitting this truth would mean confronting his own blindness, his arrogance, his complete failure to see his son clearly. And Dr. Marcus Whitfield was not prepared for that level of self-examination. You're fired, he said flatly. Leave my house immediately, and don't attempt to contact my son again. Maria smiled sadly, recognizing the fear behind his anger. As you wish, Dr. Whitfield. But Daniel wanted me to give you something before I left. She handed him a folder containing dozens of mathematical proofs, architectural sketches, and a handwritten letter that made Marcus's hands tremble. Dear Dad, I know you think I'm not smart enough, but I love numbers because they don't lie. Maria showed me that my brain isn't broken, just different. I hope someday you'll want to see the real me instead of the broken version you keep looking for. I love you anyway. Daniel. The childish handwriting conveyed thoughts that were anything but childish. Marcus stared at the letter, feeling the careful construction of his reality beginning to crumble. You have 15 minutes to leave, he managed to say, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. As Maria gathered her belongings, she could hear Daniel crying in his room upstairs. The sound cut through her professional composure, reminding her that at the center of this battle of adult egos was a brilliant child who simply wanted his father's acceptance. Dr. Whitfield, she said at the door, Daniel asked me to tell you something. He said he pretends to struggle with easy problems because he noticed you pay more attention to him when the teachers report difficulties. He thought making you worry was the only way to get you to notice him at all. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He remembered the countless parent-teacher conferences, the concerned calls from school administrators, the way his busy schedule always seemed to have time for Daniel's problems but never for Daniel's interests. Get out, he whispered, but there was no anger left in his voice, only devastation. After Maria left, Marcus stood in his son's study, surrounded by evidence of a brilliant mind he had completely failed to recognize. The mathematical proofs were elegant, the architectural drawings showed creativity and precision, and the environmental calculations demonstrated a grasp of complex systems that humbled his own understanding. 3 weeks later, the new tutor, a stern woman from an expensive educational agency, reported that Daniel had completely shut down. He refused to engage with any learning materials, spent hours staring out windows, and hadn't spoken a complete sentence since her arrival. This is typical regression, she explained to Marcus with professional detachment. Children with severe learning disabilities often retreat when their previous environments weren't sufficiently structured. But Marcus was beginning to understand that Daniel wasn't regressing, he was protecting himself. The boy had learned that showing his true abilities brought rejection, while displaying limitations brought attention and concern. Meanwhile, across the city, Maria was meeting with Dr. Jennifer Chen, a leading researcher in gifted education at Harvard. The professor examined Daniel's work with growing amazement. Maria, this is extraordinary. This child isn't just gifted, he's operating at a level I rarely see in graduate students. His approach to problem solving is completely unconventional but mathematically brilliant. I know, Maria replied. And his father thinks he's cognitively disabled. Dr. Chen shook her head in dismay. This is exactly why we're losing so many gifted children, especially those whose abilities don't fit standard patterns. How can we help this boy? I'm not sure we can, Maria admitted. His father has complete control over his educational environment, and he's convinced that Daniel needs remedial intervention rather than advanced challenges. But Maria underestimated her own determination. She had documented every session with Daniel, recorded his mathematical discoveries, and compiled a portfolio that would make any educator weep for the wasted potential. 2 months later, Dr. Marcus Whitfield received a call that shattered his carefully maintained denial. Dr. Whitfield? This is Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Massachusetts Department of Children's Education. We need to discuss some concerns about your son's educational placement. An hour later, Marcus sat in a conference room facing a panel of experts who systematically dismantled everything he believed about Daniel's abilities. These recordings were made with the child's full consent, Dr. Martinez explained, by a qualified educational specialist over a 3-month period. The first recording began with Daniel's voice, clear and articulate, explaining his solution to a complex engineering problem. The traditional approach assumes linear stress distribution, but if you consider the environmental variables and dynamic load factors, you need a more sophisticated model. Marcus felt physically ill as he listened to his son demonstrate knowledge that surpassed many of his medical colleagues. This wasn't the confused, struggling child he thought he knew, this was a brilliant mind operating at full capacity. There's more, Dr. Martinez continued. The next recording addresses your son's emotional state. Daniel's voice filled the room again. Maria, sometimes I pretend I can't do math problems because Dad seems happier when the teachers are worried about me. When I do well, he just looks disappointed that I'm not doing better. But when I struggle, he pays attention and tries to help. The devastating simplicity of that statement destroyed the last of Marcus's defenses. His son had learned that failure earned love while success brought indifference. Dr. Whitfield, Maria's voice entered the room as she joined the conference. For 3 months, your son demonstrated capabilities that would impress any mathematician or engineer. He doesn't have learning disabilities, he has gifts that have never been recognized or nurtured. Marcus stared at the evidence spread before him. Daniel's architectural designs, mathematical proofs, environmental studies, and creative problem-solving approaches that showed genius-level thinking. The specialists. He whispered. The tests, the assessments, responded to your expectations, Dr. Martinez explained. When a respected physician expresses concerns about cognitive limitations, educational professionals tend to look for confirmation rather than contradictory evidence. Maria opened another folder, revealing months of documentation. Daniel created all of this during our sessions. Mathematical models for sustainable energy, architectural plans for earthquake-resistant buildings, even original musical compositions based on mathematical sequences. Your son isn't disabled, Dr. Whitfield. He's extraordinary. The room fell silent as Marcus processed the magnitude of his failure. He had spent 3 years trying to fix a child who was never broken, missing the profound giftedness that had been right in front of him all along. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely audible. That depends on you, Dr. Martinez replied. We can recommend appropriate educational placement for a child of Daniel's abilities, but the most important factor is family support. Marcus looked up at Maria, seeing her not as a threat to his authority but as the person who had recognized his son's true potential when he had been blind to it. Miss Santos, he said quietly, would you consider returning? Not as a tutor, but as Daniel's educational advocate? I clearly don't understand what my son needs, but you do. Maria studied the broken man before her, seeing not the arrogant surgeon who had dismissed her months earlier, but a father finally ready to put his child's needs above his own ego. Only if you're prepared to see Daniel as he really is, she replied. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be cherished. 6 months later, Daniel Whitfield was enrolled in a specialized program for profoundly gifted children, working with MIT professors on projects that challenged his extraordinary abilities. But more importantly, he was thriving in a home where his differences were celebrated rather than pathologized. Dad, Daniel said one evening, showing Marcus his latest architectural design, do you think this housing complex could really help homeless families? Marcus examined his son's work, a sophisticated plan for affordable, sustainable housing that incorporated innovative engineering solutions and environmental considerations. I think you're going to change the world, Daniel, he replied, meaning every word. Maria Santos, now pursuing her doctorate in gifted education with Daniel as her primary case study, watched from the doorway as father and son worked together on mathematical problems that had once seemed impossible. She had won not by destroying Dr. Marcus Whitfield, but by opening his eyes to the extraordinary child he had almost lost through his own limitations. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating our opponents, but helping them see what they've been missing all along. The story of Daniel Whitfield became a landmark case in educational psychology, demonstrating how easily profound giftedness can be mistaken for disability when viewed through narrow lenses of expectation. It proved that every child deserves to be seen for their true potential, not what others expect of them, and in the end, the greatest transformation wasn't Daniel's, it was his father's journey from blindness to sight, from judgment to acceptance, from trying to fix what wasn't broken to celebrating what was already perfect.